Turn now to item 3 on our order paper, chaplaincy and prayers, and I call on member of the House of Keys Management and Member Standards Committee, Mrs. CAINE.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Keys Management and Member Standards Committee, it falls to me to introduce this report. After the election of a new House in September 2021, which followed the retirement of our previous chaplain, Archdeacon Andrew Brown, Mr. Speaker sent a letter to all members on the 12th of October calling for nominations for the position of chaplain of the House of Keys. He also indicated he would welcome alternative thoughts regarding prayer. We have had a chaplain for 158 years, but this time no nominations were forthcoming. The 9 respondents who made a submission all recommended a reform of the current tradition of parliamentary prayer before the commencement of business. Many questioned the appropriateness of this tradition in the modern age. One member remarked that the current structured prayers leave some members feeling uncomfortable. 4 recommended a move towards a moment of reflection or mindfulness. The Honourable Member for Douglas East, Mrs. Barber, suggested that reform presents an opportunity to reach out to the wider faith community of our island. Altogether, the responses received advocated a more secular, inclusive procedure. Prior to 1853, there is no record of prayers being said, but in 1793, and as far back as 1736, the Speaker read the oath of office at the start of proceedings. If we don't have prayers, honourable members, do we still need a chaplain? In his submission, the Bishop stated that chaplaincy exists for reasons of pastoral care. The committee were mindful of the need to preserve this valuable provision, notwithstanding a future without a chaplain. Contact was made with the Bishop, who expressed a willingness to continue this service personally. We thank Bishop Peter for this offer and commend it to members. The committee subsequently met on 2 occasions, acknowledged the submissions and considered reforming chaplaincy and parliamentary prayer. A briefing paper prepared by the Chamber and Information Service was put before the committee, presenting comparisons with other jurisdictions, with a particular focus on the occurrence of prayers elsewhere. The Northern Ireland Assembly offers the opportunity for silent individual reflection before the commencement of business. The Welsh Assembly adopts no such rituals. In the Scottish Parliament, since September 2012, the first item of business is time for reflection. Contributors are drawn from across Scotland and are chosen to represent the range of religious beliefs according to the Scottish census in a short oration, usually of a religious, educational or philosophical nature. Tradition is important, but it is equally important to ensure this body meets the needs of its members as well as the wider community. When we impose a tradition without relevance, we risk alienating people when we compel them to abide by it. The continual use of Christian prayer in the formal business of the Keys is exclusionary to those who do not adhere to any particular faith. It must be remembered that attendance from the start of the sitting is compulsory. This change presents an opportunity for us to involve and evolve as a parliament and as an island. Honourable members, with this appetite for reform in mind, the committee recommends that the House select one of the 2 alternatives. Firstly, a House of Keys Smunyut, a Manx word meaning thought or consideration, which could involve a short talk on a philosophical or educational theme or a religious theme, given by a person nominated by a member. This option would roughly replicate the time for reflection in the Scottish Parliament. Or B, a period of silence, during which members could be encouraged to reflect on the oaths or affirmations that they had taken. For clarity, should both the recommendations be rejected, then the status quo will prevail. Accordingly, the committee offers the following recommendations. Recommendations that I wholeheartedly encourage honourable members to support if we are to progress as a parliament. Firstly, recommendation 1, that the amendments to standing orders in Annex 1 of the report be made. And secondly, recommendation 2, that for a trial period of 12 months, the Secretary of the House should arrange for addresses to be known as House of Keys Smunugton to be given at the beginning of sittings in accordance with standing orders and with guidance to be issued by the Speaker. An example of the kind of guidance the Speaker might issue is at Annex 2 of the report. Essentially, honourable members, by approving both the recommendations in front of you today, from April of this year, prayers could be replaced with Smunugton to be reviewed after 12 months. Mr. Speaker, I feel a weight of responsibility in recommending this change to our parliamentary proceedings to this House, but I hope and believe it does have the support of honourable members. It is a slight but significant change, and I feel would demonstrate that the world's oldest continuous parliament is not afraid to modernise and change a tradition that began only in 1863 to suit the current membership and this modern age. I beg to move.
Honourable Member for Rushden, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Honourable Members, you all had circulated an amendment in the name of Mrs Maltby. I call on Mrs Maltby to move her amendment and make any other remarks.
Good morning, Mr Speaker and honourable members. I stand to submit an amendment as another option for members to consider. The amendment you have before you seeks that, as a matter of principle, every member should be free to participate in prayers or not according to their individual conscience, and that the Management and Member Standards Committee should consider and report on how to give effect to this principle. For me personally speaking, the recommendation from the committee is not the equilibrium I was hoping to see. Recommendation 1, if carried, would update the standing orders to remove the requirement to appoint a chaplain and to allow the possibility of either House of Keys, Smoony Act, or a period of silence instead of prayers. I cannot support a change that feels to me as an all or nothing option. If my amendment fails as it stands, I will not be able to support recommendation 1 today. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Call on the seconder to the amendment, Mrs Corlett. Honourable Member for Douglas Central. Mrs Corlett, on the basis that if you're seconding the amendment, you won't be able to speak later, would you like to make any remarks at this point?
Yes, I think I would actually. I wasn't quite prepared. I wanted to have a little listen to the debate before I got up. But what I would say is that I can't support the recommendations proposed today because I don't feel the knock-on effects of those recommendations have been thought through. There are implications that extend beyond the proceedings of this House. I think it raises all sorts of questions, the format of Tynwald Day, the words of our national anthem, the very fact that actually some church legislation has to come through Tynwald. For me, the House of Keys is a Manx institution, an institution that belongs to the people of the Isle of Man. And the views of our island residents have not been taken into consideration because they haven't been asked what their views are. Where's the voice of the people of our island? What do they think? We as members of this Honourable House we're temporary residents. And I think we have a duty to listen to, respond and to present the views of our constituents. And I've had many people contact me over the last few days objecting to the fact that prayers could be removed. I've only had one person write to me in support of the recommendations. And on a personal level, I feel that I should try to justify why I want to keep prayers when I don't actually have any religious beliefs myself. And sometimes it's very hard to articulate the way you feel. It's hard to translate what's in your heart to other people. And the reason I'm seconding Mrs Maltby's amendment today really is that I feel it allows members a choice. I strongly feel that we should keep prayers as a part of the procedure, but I do agree that it would be it would be better if members were not obligated to attend, and I feel Mrs Maltby's amendment gives us that opportunity. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you very much. Honourable Member for Oncombe, Mr Collister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the House of Keys Management and Members Standards Committee for their report, but I'll not be supporting the recommendations from the committee today. Mr Speaker, I'm all for modernisation and reform of the House of Keys, and I'm proud to be standing in this House that has witnessed so much political change since 1881. And on occasion, this small island with a population of just over 84,000 in the middle of the Irish Sea has been at the forefront of that political change. However, those changes must reflect our society and our community, and according to the 2021 census that's just been published, this island is still very much a Christian society. We're also a society that continues to welcome other faiths, but coming together as a single community, and a community in which everyone feels safe regardless of faith and religion. The House of Keys election was held just a few months ago, and I cannot recall a single occasion on the doorstep or during media interviews or even during the hustings when the House of Keys prayers were mentioned by any candidate standing for election or by a constituent as a burning issue, but more importantly by those members that are currently sitting on the House of Keys Management and Members Standards Committee. Therefore, I do question the timing of this motion. I know from listening to my own constituents in Oncombe over the last few days that they don't care what elected members do before a sitting on a Tuesday morning. What they do care about is how this House and the other place will be addressing serious social concerns around higher energy costs over the next couple of years, interest rates, inflationary pressures, hospital waiting lists, mental health, and of course how they can access affordable housing. In other words, they don't see any value in us arguing about removing prayers at the start of a sitting when there are so many bigger issues facing this island at the moment. Mr Speaker, but they do fully respect and appreciate the values and traditions and history that this chamber represents, which is such a privilege to sit in on behalf of the island's wider Manx community, but also on behalf of our constituents. It also mirrors my own personal view, as I don't have strong religious beliefs, but I do fully respect the values, tradition and history of this House. I also fully respect that as a member of this House of Keys, I'm also expected to attend various church and community services each year, all of which have prayers and hymns as part of that service. These include Tynwald Day, Remembrance Sunday, Armed Forces, Civic Sunday, and of course the Tynwald Carol service, to name a few. Mr Speaker, is the mover of this motion and the other members of that committee telling constituents they only re-elected them a few months ago that they are no longer attending any service within their constituents that includes prayers or hymns? I guess the answer is no. So why try and change the current system of this House? Enough said, Mr Speaker. I will not be supporting the motion.
The Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr Ashford.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I need to start by pointing out the irony of the speech I'll be actually delivering today, as I'm not religious in any way and was actually one of the 10 members of the last Keys that voted to remove the Lord Bishop's vote during the Lisvane debates. But I do respect tradition, and I never thought I'd be delivering this speech to this Honourable House. At 5 days' notice, a report has been landed on honourable members and the wider public, who are the ones who actually put us here, proposing major changes to the way our traditions operate without any examination of the wider consequences of such a change. What I found quite interesting, Mr Speaker, and I'll come into this in a bit more detail, but I have had more people contact me over this than I had over the island plan. Something that's fundamentally got to drive forward our island. And I have listened to the debate outside that's been happening over those 5 days, some of it with a bit of amusement, actually. And again, I've got to say I come from this with someone with no religious beliefs, but in particular to comments that I've heard saying we aren't a Christian society or that we're in fact a secular society. Well, we've just had the census figures, Mr Speaker, that tell a very different story. The predominant religion is still Christian, totalling 54.7% of those that responded, or if you include those that didn't respond, 48.44% of our total population. Those who stated they had no religion was 43.8% of those that responded, or 38.78% of the total population, still some 10 to 11% behind those who indicated they were Christian. Other religions made up 1.6% of respondents, or 1.37% of the total population. It is exceptionally important, Mr. Speaker, that we show respect and tolerance to all religious views, and also those, including myself, who don't hold religious views at all. And that we are also welcoming to differing ideologies and beliefs. But it is equally important, Mr. Speaker, that we respect our Christian heritage as well, and the many people who hold that dear, which is a large proportion of our society, and there's no getting away from that. We also shouldn't assume that those who state they are not religious support such a change as is being proposed today. I marked the census as non-religious, as I know did many others who were completely opposed to this proposed change today. Sticking with the census figures, Mr. Speaker, one of the things I did find interesting is it included age groups from birth on the religion question. So apparently of those aged 0 to 4, apparently 1,074 are Christian and 1,944 have no religion. As someone who likes statistics, that did make me smile, Mr. Speaker. How on earth the answer to that question can have any relevance at that age is a debate I would actually love to have, but probably for another time. If I asked my two 11-year-olds and 13-year-old, are they religious, they wouldn't have a clue and would probably stare at me blankly. Well, that's if I could get them to look up from their devices long enough, but that's an entirely different debate. So what is interesting is if you look at the age groups where they can make an informed decision, so those aged 20 or over. As an aside, Mr. Speaker, I would have liked to have done it from 18, but the census doesn't group ages that way. So looking at those aged 20 or over, those who say they are Christian represents 57.6% of those that responded, or 51% of the total population, so over half. Those with no religion were 40.88% of those that responded, or 36.23% of that total population. So if you focus on those ages that you can say can make an informed decision, the gap is even wider, with a gap of 17% between those who say they are Christian and those who say they are non-religious. So although it may upset some, Mr. Speaker, no matter what way you look at it, we are a Christian society, and that's coming from someone with no religious leanings. In terms of the secular society reference, which I've also heard come up in debate, we're actually the exact opposite of a secular society. The very definition of a secular society is a society that separates the state and religion. As much, again, as some may not actually like it, we have an established church. Our head of state is also head of that church, and it's contained explicitly within the coronation oath. By my count, and the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mrs Corlett, inferred it, I was sad enough to go away and count it. By my count, we have 45 pieces of Church of England ecclesiastical primary legislation in force on the Manx Statute Book at this current moment, from the Church Act of 1895 through to the Church Fees Measure Act 2014, where by law we stipulate what fees the board of the diocese can prescribe. So I'm sorry, the idea we're some sort of secular society just to me isn't correct and doesn't stand up to one moment's scrutiny. So today we remove prayers from the start of the House of Keys, Mr. Speaker. Where does that stop? As has already been said, what about the Tynwald Day service? The clue's in the name, it's a service. If some members are uncomfortable with a set of prayers at the start of Tynwald, or House of Keys, they're going to be very uncomfortable come Tynwald Day. What about the National Service of Remembrance? That's also a service, a religious service. Now, obviously, I hear the cry, of course not. We don't want to interfere with those things. But then if that's the case, what makes them acceptable and the prayers before Keys and Tynwald not? In fact, our national anthem, which we sing with gusto, contains in the first verse, O gem of God's earth, and the second verse, or what we use as the second verse, is actually the 8th, goes on to say, and in the Lord's promise confide, that each single hour we trust in his power. So does that need to change as well if we're moving towards this secular society? As you don't have many things more associated with a state than a country's national anthem. So it's not as simple as it seems once you actually start delving into it. It's also worth looking at what is the actual prayers we participate in before sittings. So the prayer used is Psalm 67, which of course is a reference to where it is in the King James Bible. But I haven't seen many people pointing out, so I've got the feeling not many people know, that Psalm 67 is actually a multi-faith prayer. It has links into other religions. As an example, it's an important part of Judaism and is often recited before. And for anyone, a member of Judaism out there, I apologise for the pronunciation here, they'll be wincing, but is often recited before Maraviv on Motzei Shabbat. It is also often turned into a Shaviti. It's actually, ironically, more multi-faith than the Lord's Prayer, which we use at the end of our prayers, which is mainly Christian, which I have noticed in the past some members who don't join in with Psalm 67 do join in with. But there is actually a simple solution to this dilemma today, Mr. Speaker, and I'm delighted with the amendment that's come from the Honourable Member for Douglas South, Mrs Maltby, because if a member really is that uncomfortable sitting through prayers, then they should have the option of entering the chamber after prayers have completed. That is the system that's used in the House of Commons and many other legislatures. The new system being proposed, Mr. Speaker, as well, moving on to that, seems to be a bit of a system designed to please everyone, but can actually end up pleasing no one. The first thing I would say is good luck to whoever has to decide what is and isn't offensive in terms of delivery and what can and can't be said, because I wouldn't want that job. What I find offensive or don't find offensive might offend or not offend someone else. There may also have to be some very subjective judgments made, and I'm glad if this goes through, it won't be me making them. One thing this report has done is provoke interest, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 4 days, as of the start of this sitting, and I've had a couple more since, but I haven't added them into the number, I have been contacted by 71 people in total in relation to this. Of those, over half point out in their remarks that they're not religious. Of those 71, only 6 have contacted me in support of the change, with 65 against. Ironically, 3 of the 6 who've contacted me to support the change have stated they are religious. So almost all those who have contacted me who have no religious leanings are against the change. So if it's unity and inclusiveness that was wanted as a result of this report, well, it appears to have been achieved. Well, unity across beliefs and ideals against the change, that is. This institution, with over its 1,000 years of history, does not belong to those of us who sit here today, Mr. Speaker. We are simply the custodians for a short, in fact infinitely short, period of time. We, whether we like it or not, are just passing through. Tynwald and its institutions belong to the Manx people. If we are going to change one of the fundamental pieces of heritage of this island and Parliament, then it's the people that should decide to do it, not us just here today off the back of 4 to 5 days. I would hardly call 5 days and no public consultation the way to do that. Make no mistake, a decision by the elected chamber of our Parliament to move away from its Christian traditions to a more secular approach is a major step, one that should not be taken without serious forethought of the possible repercussions, some of which I've already outlined. I'm not religious, Mr. Speaker, and as I've stated in my open remarks, I never thought I would have to deliver the speech I'm delivering today. But whether honourable members like it or not, we do live in a Christian society. Tearing up traditions with 5 days' notice is not the way, I believe, an historic Parliament that we should rightly be proud of here in our island should do things. Yeah. This really does smack to me of change for change's sake, an attempt to appear progressive and modern without thinking it clearly through. Yeah. So after that speech, Mr. Speaker, it will come as absolutely no surprise that I will not be supporting what I believe is an ill-thought-out, knee-jerk and ill-considered proposal, but I will happily support the amendment in the name of Mrs Maltby.
On the Honourable Member for Albury, Castletown and Maloo, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am almost tempted to say I agree, but I'll give a bit more insight. It has been said that you never fully recognise the value of what you have until it is gone. I would suggest the unique mix of formality, prayer and tradition is something together which make the initial proceedings of this chamber in Tynwald Court so incredibly special. The perfect transition from everyday life into a parliamentary sitting. I'm certainly not against change when it is done in an appropriate way and for good reason. I have genuine concerns that these changes will result in a bland outcome, which actually means we'll be worse off. I like certainty, routine and tradition. That's what we have. Personal choices are important, and I will defend that right. I have received a lot of correspondence from constituents about this, and all but one say, please leave things as they are. Given our use of Psalm 67, and thank you, Minister, for raising the multi-religious aspects to it, it was hopefully a positive sign on Sunday afternoon at Kirkmaloo, where the congregation was 67, including 8 children and a baby. Why is there such a rush? My colleague from Arby Castletown in Maloo was really eager to contribute to this debate today, but he hasn't got the chance. Is that right? A change of this magnitude warrants much more consideration than has been allowed so far. As we debate this, there has been no input from the people, and only 5 days between the publication of the proposal and the scheduled House of Keys debate. That's not a justifiable way to carry out such a reform, is it? I'm not comfortable with raising this, but there has been the suggestion shared by some that a member of the committee's religious beliefs would impact on their ability to fulfil their role within Keys. I feel that needs to be brought out and clarified in terms of can that person's existing role be fulfilled given the current situation. The decision by the primary chamber of the Manx Parliament to change its cultural framework from Christianity to secular would be a significant and historical step. Whatever one's views, clearly the most important thing is to look at the wider issues. To be dealing with this on a wet Tuesday morning in a rushed manner is really limiting. Equally important is the need to have those traditional links which unite us with many early generations. The words in the Psalms and prayers are key ingredients in terms of what we have, and I think to move away from them would detract from something really special. If the House of Keys is to turn its back on many years of tradition, I would suggest that 5 days is hardly adequate notice. Only 5 days between the publication of the proposals and the scheduled debate is neither appropriate nor adequate. To see the headlines on Thursday morning's paper and the rushed email from Mr. Speaker really does leave me concerned about this. We need time to consider this change, and ideally we will retain things as they are. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member for Aaron Michael, Mr. Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do stand to oppose this motion. When in September last year I stood for election to the House of Keys, I did so knowing fully the implications and expectations, many daunting, of putting myself forward for elected office. An office within this ancient court of Tynwald, at an island whose ancient laws and customs we either swore or affirmed to use our best endeavours to maintain. At the very heart of that process is the swearing of an oath or affirmation to Her Majesty the Queen, Lord of Man, Defender of the Faith. I was also fully aware of the formalities and ceremonies, including prayer, that form part of the standing orders of the House of Keys and Tynwald Court. Mr. Speaker, I believe it is impossible to unravel these ancient laws and customs and separate church from state without it having huge consequences for the very cultural fabric of our island. If this motion passes today, the next move may well be the ending of prayers in Tynwald, the abolition of the role of the Lord Bishop, and the complete dismantling of our annual Tynwald ceremony. I ask those honourable members who say they feel uncomfortable with prayers, and I acknowledge their concerns, is this the process that you are willing to see happen? Because that is a real consequence if we vote for this motion today. I am sure, as part of your duties, as elected representatives, honourable members attend functions, for example, a civic service, a remembrance service, our Tynwald Carol service or a church funeral, all with religious elements and all surely part of our duties and responsibilities as members of the House of Keys. Please remember, honourable members, we in this place are part of something that is much more important than we will be individually. We are merely passing through, trying to do our bit, our best for this place and our island. But we will soon be forgotten, and that is how it should be. So let's not be the ones who are remembered for changing our ancient customs and fabric forever, because that is what will happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Middle, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Social media commentators have been saying this weekend that it's a disgrace that we're even discussing this matter when there are so many more important issues to concentrate on. But as other members have said, I've never in my short political career had so many letters and emails from constituents on any one topic as I've had on prayers in Keys. So this debate has merit and is in the public interest. This isn't a pressing issue to me. When I was elected, I knew that I'd have to attend prayers before each sitting. And like wearing a silly hat and rented suit on Tynwald Day, it was something that I knew was expected of me. But given the option, and currently we don't have the option, I'd choose to do neither of those things. We actually had 2 lots of prayers a week ago, which further tested my lack of faith. I've had letters from people suggesting that this is the thin end of the woke wedge, which I find quite amusing given my views on woke nonsense. I also don't think that the heritage and history of prayers should be considered sacrosanct. There are many areas where this Parliament has moved with the times and for the better. If we still have prayers because we don't like change, then we're just paying lip service to any separation of church and state. I wonder if those members of the public who members have talked about who insist that we keep prayers would be prepared to start their working day on the knees in prayer. As an atheist, I simply feel like a spare part when the beseeching starts. That said, I have the greatest respect for people of faith, any faith, and quite envy their belief in a higher power. It must be a most reassuring thing to think that there's something wonderful to look forward to post-mortem. But I don't. I expect to cease to exist, just like I didn't exist before I was born. Our American cousins have a saying which sums religion up for me: you either got it or you don't got it. And I never got it. So I think that we should abolish mandatory attendance at prayers in Keys, although I expect that any change will be defeated by a sizable majority today. I think we should start sittings with business, so even the idea of a mindful minute also strikes me as superfluous. I can do that before the sitting, as could those honourable members who want to pray. I support Mrs. Maltby's option. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call on the Honourable Member for Middle, Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to follow my colleague from Middle on this topic. I've listened with great interest so far to the debate, and like other honourable members, I have received a number of emails which I have reflected on as well. I'd like to start by saying, as a person of faith, and I confirmed my faith when I was 12, Mr. Ashford, which I think would suggest that there are a number of people in the census who can be recognised as having a choice and making a determination about their faith from a relatively young age. So as a person of faith, albeit not a regular churchgoer, I have, since I've been privileged to be a member of first the Legislative Council and now this House, actively participated in prayers. Now, I would not wish to speculate on whether my participation improves my ability to contribute to the issues of the day that come before this House. My choice to participate in prayer is a very personal one, as matters of faith and belief usually are. I am aware, however, that my personal faith is not shared by all members of this House. We have differences in faith and belief among honourable members, something which is already reflected in core aspects of our procedures, such as the choice to affirm rather than swear the oath of office. This does, honourable members, reflect wider society. Yes, the latest census shows that just over 54% cite Christianity as their faith. But this means that 46% do not consider themselves Christian and have a different religion or belief. In serving as a member of this House, I recognise my duty to serve all constituents, both those of Christian faith and those of a different faith or belief. And it is this recognition that led me to reflect that adapting this House's traditions in recognition of other faiths and beliefs might be something that we should consider. Since the committee's report was published only a week ago, I have had 16, including this morning's 2, people contact me to make the case as to why Christian prayers should be retained. And I recognise that there has been a great deal of strong feeling expressed. Some have urged that prayer is important for members to be able to receive spiritual guidance, to assist decision-making in this House's business. Whilst that may assist those members of faith, it really does not sit comfortably with me that those who do not have a faith would be any the poorer or less capable when it comes to making decision-making and transacting business in this House. Yeah. Some have urged that this is an important part of tradition, and we lose more than an element of spirituality if we discontinue or change the current approach to prayers before sitting. This concern for tradition is one that has been expressed by people who say they are not religious themselves, but do not want to see any change. I've thought a lot about this strong feeling and reflected on the wise words of the former president of Tynwald, Steve Roden, who reminded us, and others have said so far this morning, that we are all birds of passage and should think carefully when making changes to practices and procedures that have endured for substantial periods of time. And I agree that change such as this should not be made without proper consideration. I also reflect, as others have, that the short period between the publication of the committee's report and time for consideration is perhaps one of the factors that has led to so many voicing their concerns with the proposed change. I think because some of the implications that others have touched upon have not been articulated and explained in the wider public mind. However, Mrs. CAINE, in her opening remarks, made clear that this is not the first time that there would be any change in the way that we begin our sittings. Reference has already been made to the fact that the standing orders of the House of Keys of 1736 and 1793 do not require prayers at the start of the sitting. They reference restatement of the oath of office. So when we talk about centuries of enduring tradition, I do think we need to reflect that the traditions of this House of Keys have and will continue to adapt to reflect not only its membership, but wider society. And I believe that traditions that endure very often adapt. An individual called me last week and pointed out the pagan aspects of the present-day Tynwald ceremony, the rushes on the processional way, and the wearing of bol and bane. The marriage of pagan traditions with an ancient open-air assembly and today, yes, a Christian service, is a strong illustration of how what we do and know today as our National Tynwald Day ceremony actually reflects the evolution and adaptation of traditions over time. Concern has also been expressed that to make change to prayers before sitting of this House will inevitably lead to constitutional problems, particularly as regards the Queen's position as Lord of Man. There is concern expressed, and it has been expressed this morning, that the wording of our national anthem will need to be changed. Honourable members, I am struggling with these wider constitutional implications. The research paper, which forms part of the committee's report, references the practices adopted in other assemblies, and Mrs. CAINE, in her opening remarks, also referenced them. They range from no formal practice in the Welsh Assembly, to a period of quiet reflection in the Northern Ireland Assembly, to a time for reflection in the Scottish Assembly, which has been referenced, draws on a range of contributors reflecting different religious beliefs. As far as I'm aware, the constitutional arrangements for all of these assemblies are that the Queen is head of state. Thus, there does not seem to be any basis for the assertion that a change to the current practice at the start of our own sittings inevitably holds these constitutional implications. Interestingly, Professor Edge, some may have read his blog on this, an established authority on constitutional and legal matters, does not suggest any constitutional implications that would arise from a change in practice. Indeed, he recognises that a change perhaps to a period of silent contemplation would be, as he puts it, sufficiently capacious to address the needs of a diverse chamber and a Manx population. My personal perspective is that whilst the current practice of Christian prayers speaks to my faith, and I recognise a large number of people who share the Christian faith, I would prefer to embrace the diversity of belief in this House and in wider society. My concern to have an inclusive society is something I feel strongly about, have long felt strongly about, and did indeed reference in my manifesto. And indeed, I believe it is something that is rooted in my faith. I understand the feelings of those who would prefer to stay as we are, and I recognise that in making change, proper consideration as to what type of change is important. However, honourable members, in embracing other views, in voting for some type of change, I see not a loss, but a potential opportunity to gain by recognising the viewpoints, religious or not, of others. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Rushen, Dr Haywood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said in my response to the call from the committee for nominations for a chaplain and for alternative thoughts regarding prayers, I initially found myself conflicted on this matter. On one hand, we've all taken oaths or affirmations to uphold the traditions of this establishment, but on the other hand, it's clear that an exclusively Christian prayer doesn't necessarily reflect the makeup of our society. And in fact, with the evidence submitted to the committee, several members mentioned that prayer by rote was causing discomfort for some of our members. Religion is based on divine laws which no human can alter. By contrast, politics should respond to the needs and requirements of society and be able to move ahead and adjust itself to the new challenges of time. Our authority doesn't come from a spiritual being, but from our fellow citizens who elected us to deal with the business of governing our society. Science, technology, economics and knowledge are defining our communities. Religious beliefs no longer have the same impact on our decision-making. In fact, for those persecuted for their sexuality because of the condemnation from a religious perspective, it's clear that the inclusion of religious beliefs in politics can have a severe and detrimental effect on those valued members of our society. I think the key aspect for me is that I believe there should be a separation between religion and politics. One does not have to subscribe to a faith to have moral standards, demonstrate cooperation, mutual respect, sympathy or empathy. Faith does not always differentiate right from wrong, nor do exhortations to any deity aid in our collective responsibility to our society. However, this is not a debate about the wider relationship between the church and state, and I'm not going to discuss disestablishmentarianism or anti-disestablishmentarianism. Sorry, Hansard. This is not the thin end of the wedge, and it's not right to try and widen it out to that. This is a place for politics. This chamber is a place for political discussions. I consider that there is a value to a few moments of calm at the start of a sitting, a chance to still the body and focus the mind to the upcoming discussions and decisions. However, I don't think that prayers currently achieve this aim. It's clear that some members feel uncomfortable, and that's not the sort of inclusive organisation we should be aspiring to. Continuing the use of a Christian prayer in the formal business of the House and requiring members to be present for it seems disrespectful to those of no belief and disrespectful to those of other beliefs. I'd be happy to support the idea of a Smoon Act, giving voice to all faiths and none on a nomination basis, a chance to inspire, console, challenge and focus our minds. I believe that the committee, with the support of the Chamber and Information Service, did present a careful and considered guide to manage a Smoon Act, and that trialling this option for a period of 12 months would allow members to evaluate the pros and cons of this approach. So although I started this process with slight ambivalence, the more I consulted and considered, the stronger my view has become. I choose in this instance to be an elected disruptor. Separating prayer from the business of this House will not weaken the faith of those that believe. The real strength in religion lies in the belief in the truth of that religion, and it doesn't require the patronage or protection of the state to make that so. When this House was elected, it was clearly acknowledged that this was the most diverse House ever, more reflective of our society than at any time in history. Choosing to recognise that our society has changed and to adapt our protocols is the privilege of politicians, and one that I think we should embrace.
On the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When I was out canvassing, bucketing down with rain, stood outside a block of flats, pushing buttons, hoping, nearly praying, but hoping somebody would let me in. And someone answered, and in a booming voice, first words out of the mouth, "What do you think about God?" Wow, never been greeted like that before. Right at that moment in time, drenched as I was, soaked to my skin, I thought, well, I have some particular feelings in this moment. But the question really threw me a little bit, actually. But it has made me consider the question in some depth. And we've heard a lot of talk this morning around the Isle of Man being a Christian society, and lots of talk about what that means, actually, in practice. I'm uncomfortable with that phrase, actually, because being Christian isn't one size fits all. There are multiple different denominations, all of whom have different perspectives. Even the Lord's Prayer is slightly different depending on if you're Catholic or Anglican. So there's all sorts of nuance hidden underneath that word Christian, I think. So this half of the Isle of Man that does follow the Christian faith to some degree isn't necessarily all following the same denomination of that faith. But really, I think what it made me think about, and what it means to me, is more that we're an island with a Christian tradition, rather than being a Christian island or a secular island. A lot of us were raised in Christian tradition. I myself used to go to church as a kid. My uncle's a priest. We all go through this. But actually, you make your own minds up as to whether or not you do have faith, whether you do believe or not. And I think, as I said in my letter to the committee, these days most people don't express their faith necessarily through formal communal prayer. We express it through our acts and our deeds and our decisions and our everyday lives. That's how most people these days express their faith. And we see this through declining church numbers, through the increasing number of people who may tick a box on the census because they think it's what they're supposed to do or the right thing, but maybe doesn't accurately reflect how they really feel inside. I've heard this morning that there should be some concern whether or not an individual's faith or beliefs influences their decision-making in this Honourable House, and the assertion that perhaps it shouldn't. I would argue the exact opposite. I would think if you are a person of faith and it doesn't influence your decision-making, then really are you a person of faith? And so in the same way that perhaps Ms Poole-Wilson's faith will influence her decision-making, I would expect Mr Peters' lack of faith to influence his as well. And that, for me, throws up one of the concerning aspects of emails I've received over the last few days, in that a number of people have almost implied that without faith, without asking a higher being for support and advice and guidance, it's almost impossible to make good decisions. Now, I challenge that perception quite strongly. I think it's absolutely possible to make good decisions without seeking divine intervention. But the view that's been expressed to me along those lines is one of concern, because I know that's not what most people believe. It is definitely a minority viewpoint, I think. One other thing that interested me quite a lot by the committee's report was a lack of interest in appointing a chaplain. I am quite surprised to hear a number of members stand up and say just how important faith is to this Honourable House, but actually no one suggested that we should have someone to lead us in that space, to provide that pastoral care. Not even a suggestion, as far as I'm aware, that maybe the Bishop could take over that role, which I'm aware he's kindly offered to do. And so there's a bit of a disconnect there for me between what people are saying today in this Honourable House and what they told the committee at the time. And I think that as well speaks a little bit to some of the comments that have been made around Tynwald Day and the National Anthem and others. Actually, I absolutely expect there to be religious elements to our remembrance services, to our National Day, to our Tynwald ceremony, because they are very much services. They are very much ceremonial occasions or religious services. There is definitely a place for religion in a religious service, I would argue. I'm less convinced there is a place for religion in a political setting, in a place that is designed to pass laws, to undertake work, to assure good governance of the island. And it's not a religious service. We don't do things in here based on a particular religious perspective. We do things in here based on what we believe is right, based on the views and representations of our constituents. And so for that reason, I don't accept some of the constitutional arguments that have been made, both in writing and today on the floor. I completely accept the comments made by my honourable colleague, Ms Poole-Wilson from Middle. I think she's absolutely spot on there. This is simply a question about prayers in this Honourable House. It doesn't extend any further than that. for all sorts of very good reasons. I'd also like to briefly touch on this idea of tradition. We have a 1,000-year history in Tynwald. Prayers have been around for about 100. So if we are going to start talking about retaining important traditions, I am all for reintroducing some good old-fashioned Norse traditions to our Tynwald Day ceremony, although perhaps, Chief Minister, I would draw the line at ritual sacrifice.
Worth a go.
Standards Committee will be interested in that.
I'm also a little bit disturbed by the suggestion that I've had in writing, and I'm sure I've heard today, that members can leave the chamber if they're uncomfortable during prayer. I think that's fundamentally wrong, actually. We're here to do a job, and actually asking some people to excuse themselves whilst others undertake a religious exercise, I think is again slightly flawed. It's almost saying one group is slightly more valued than another, or slightly more right than another, and again that feels to me to be wrong. One area that I absolutely agree with, I think everyone who's spoken so far, is the lack of public engagement on this. I think this is an issue which actually none of us really stood and talked about on the doorstep. My manifesto did include very clear commitments to enabling personal choice in all aspects of our lives, but I don't think anyone really sat and talked about this with the public because it wasn't on anyone's mind. There are bigger issues to worry about. And so I think if we are going to start down this road, down this path, I think it's incumbent on our committee to actually talk to the public who we represent and say, actually, is this something you want us to do? Is this the direction of travel you want to go in? And I very much like Mrs. Maltby's amendment because I think that enables them the opportunity to do that. Say, go away and actually figure out how we as members of this Honourable House can ensure that we can follow our own personal beliefs or lack thereof and do so in such a way that respects the traditions of Tynwald, of the House of Keys, that respects the views of a sizable number of people on the Isle of Man, even if they aren't technically in a majority anymore. I think it's important that they are an essential part of this process, that there is that public engagement. So despite my own personal views, I actually wouldn't have supported the original recommendations today because I think they were a step too far, too fast. But I will happily support this amendment. And I'd just like to close by reading something from the Lord Bishop's submission to the committee, which I think really sums all of this up for me quite nicely. He says, the practice of opening each sitting of the House of Keys is also an exercise in humility, reminding us of the limitations of our own understanding and of the possibility that more wisdom and insight may be required than we can reasonably possess. It underlines the enduring significance and implications of political legislation and thus reminds us of the responsibility that we carry and the authority that is invested in us. And I think that's the critical point for me to take away today, is not the act of praying itself, but that moment of reflection, of sitting back and saying, actually, what are we doing here? Why are we here? Who are we responsible for? And to understand and appreciate the burden of some of that responsibility. Interestingly, the Bishop concludes his remarks by saying, I'm sure that these prayers could take a number of different forms, spoken or otherwise, and that this might come from a range of traditions of faith, although a relationship to the historic ethos of the House and to the current cultural background of members would be valuable. It might equally come from a rota representing different Christian denominations, although the single point of contact for dedicated pastoral care would be diluted. So even the Bishop acknowledges that actually there is a case for change, and simply retaining prayers in their current form probably isn't sustainable. So I just ask you to think about that, honourable members, when you're casting your votes today.
I call on the Honourable Member for Onchan Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the clerk is going to circulate an amendment that I think all members should read carefully and listen to the words I have to say. I was alarmed that this motion is before this honourable place today when there is so much important work that this administration needs to get on with. I have to say I've had dozens of emails, like many members, from my constituents and also from many other people, all opposed to the removal of prayers from House of Keys sittings and expressing their concerns about the removal of prayers with the implications of such a proposal. Many have expressed concern that this is the thin edge of the wedge to cancelling our many ceremonies and traditions, and in particular Tynwald Day ceremony. I trust those of you in favour of this motion and those of you who have stated that you feel uncomfortable or conflicted or that prayers are outdated and cannot endure our short period of prayer will not be partaken in ceremonies such as Tynwald Day. These ceremonies being based on Christian beliefs and normally conducted by members of the clergy. Have people forgotten they were elected into the House of Keys and should have known the routines, traditions of the branches, and any member who didn't wish for that should have highlighted their view on this significant change to the electorate in their manifestos? I don't recall seeing it in individual manifestos or party or Labour or Liberal Vannon Party manifestos. These interests should be declared to the electorate when members are seeking election to this honourable place. It's change and full transparency with the electorate that is the key message here, so that the constituents are confident their views are heard in a democratic process. I believe the motion is ill thought out, completely contradictory to the message of inclusivity, and I believe it is undemocratic. The majority of us in this House taken an oath and swearing to use our best endeavours to maintain the ancient laws and custom of this isle. Our Parliament was formed on Christian values and traditions, and prayer is at the heart of many of our ceremonies. Some may think small adjustments are okay, but perhaps don't understand the unwelcome consequences. On the 27th of September, the swearing-in of the House of Keys and those who participated in taking an oath on behalf of your constituencies. It included use your best endeavours to maintain the ancient laws and custom of this isle. These commitments form the foundation of our democracy and ancient tradition and custom of the oldest parliament in the world. You were happy to sign up to this, and it's disappointing to see that some intend to renege on that promise only 5 months later. Where does tradition stop, Mr. Speaker? Should the Speaker stop wearing his wig?
Yes.
Yeah.
What about expensive portraits on the wall?
Stop that too.
Paid for by the taxpayer, the people that put members in their temporary seats, Mr. Speaker. Should that stop now, before yours reaches the walls of this great place? When I walked into this chamber for the first time, as a proud Manx woman, I wanted to take part in every aspect of the privilege to be in this honourable place, representing the people of Onken. The way constitutional traditional changes can occur without public consultation concerns me, and the purpose of my amendment is to ensure that the Standing Orders Committee take ownership of changes to standing orders and consider the implications on change to our traditions without democratic consultation with the very people that have put us in our seats here today. The amendment from the Honourable Member Mrs MALTBY is supporting change for the few, not the many, and still doesn't require consultation with the public. Mr. Speaker, I encourage members to support my amendment so that the Standing Orders Committee, not the same committee that have come forward with this report, so that they can advise on how significant changes that impact our traditions will take place and be consulted on. Alternatively, honourable members, please listen to these words, as they are often used by residents of our island. Another report left on the shelf. Perhaps voting the whole motion down and leaving the report on the shelf is the best option for honourable members here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the honourable member for Douglas Central, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll try and react to the amendments before us and some of the observations, rather than using too much of any prepared remarks I had. The first point to say is that I think that Mrs. Maltby's amendment is helpful, and I enjoyed the discussion I had of it with her at the weekend, because it does recognise that there is an important principle about whether or not you participate in something, the freedom of choice aspect of it. I've always affirmed I was one of those people who had little chance with Christianity because my parents decided for me that they weren't going to christen me before I was 4 or at any stage. But I've always respected the period of prayers at the beginning, and I do think there's something in Mrs. Maltby's amendment that's very worthwhile in that sense. Just to go back slightly to my prepared remarks and actually to use a little bit of modernisation and reform to help it. I believe that Culture Vannin, the excellent Culture Vannin, which operates a free translation service in conjunction with the Manx Language Advisory Council, was actually approached about the Manx word that was to be used in this report without any context. It was just asked for a translation of reflection, as in serious thought or consideration. And if we decide to send this back to the Management and Member Standards Committee, I do hope that the Management and Member Standards Committee will also re-engage with Culture Vannin and the Council, because I think there are probably 3 options, each of which is better than the current proposal in terms of using the Manx language. And if I just play them how they would sound.
First one.
Yeah, well, that's not in order. If you could just... You're more than welcome to make your best efforts at translation, and we'll make sure that Hansard reflects them accurately, but please turn that off. Thank you.
Okay, so basically, technology has always been helpful for modernisation, and that's an important point. So essentially, there might be a Gaelic alternative to capture the idea that we were having an opening thought of the House of Keys. Secondly, a thought for the House of Keys, and thirdly, a thought of the day for the House of Keys, and would welcome re-engagement with any committee that looks at this further to make sure we get this right if we are going to go down that route. But that leads on to the even more important point of my comments, which is it's important to do constitutional change right. We do have in the other place, the Constitution, Legal Affairs and Justice Committee. So when we come to look at all these constitutional issues, that would be the right place to do it. I think Mrs. Edge has actually captured a very important part of this, which is that I think it's important that the Standing Orders Committee actually thinks through ideas wherever they come from properly to actually make sure things are captured in the Standing Orders Committee. And rather than going ahead with Mrs. Maltby's amendment, I will second Mrs. Edge's proposal, because that actually moves the next consideration over to a different group of people, with only the Speaker as a common member. As far as I can see, we quickly looked at it, it's Mr. Ashford, Mr. Christian, Mr. Hooper, Mr. Glover and Ms. Farragher who would be involved in the Standing Orders consideration. And as long as it's the Standing Orders Committee of the House
Member give way
of Keys.
very briefly. Sorry, just to clarify, Miss Edge's amendment says that standing orders with constitutional implications should not be altered. As we've already heard, this particular amendment has no constitutional implications, so the amendment wouldn't apply to what's being discussed today. And actually, if you believe it does, who makes that determination?
So I'm always pleased to give way, very respectful in that sense, and that's exactly the point I was going to make. So if there are constitutional amendments, there's the constitutional alternative, but this in itself is just changes to the procedural business, and that's why I'm seconding Mrs. Edge's proposal, because if it's just a standing orders change, which seems doubtful it is in the perception of the public who we represent and the history of which we're part, I do think it needs to be taken beyond this. When you, as a person who's made some substantial changes to the way that this place operates and the way that we elect the Chief Minister and the way that we actually see our own constitution ourselves, I do believe that it's right to do things right in that sense. So the changes in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland came after the Kilbrandon report in the 1970s, and they were fully thought through and fully considered. And incidentally, Kilbrandon also suggested that we only needed a single chamber, and that any parliament should make sure it had at least 100 members, was another part of the Kilbrandon report. It's important to do things right. In terms of the changes that I brought forward in December 2017, they've been well considered by Lord Lisfane. They were the subject of a private member's bill brought by the now current Chief Minister that I had the privilege to second at its first time it was debated, and then they were considered by the Legislative Council before the House of Keys took them forward properly. So it's very important to do things right. And just and then two final points. The first one is that I don't see that this appeared in any people's manifestos. It's certainly not important in my manifesto. It's nowhere is it mentioned. I do have quite substantial change to the way that democracy operates in my manifesto, and this, like the Crown, is nowhere in my manifesto, and it's completely it's not relevant for these times. However, publishing documents on the new Tynwald Business Register for 6 weeks external scrutiny is number one in terms of my manifesto commitments for reform, and it would be hypocritical of me 1 week to talk about the island plan in one way and the next week in the House of Keys to talk about this issue in a different way. And I do think the whole idea about the way that this has been gone about is we need to learn from. And the second point is if we are going to begin to change the relationship between the state and the church, we need to think about it properly. So, for instance, back in 2019, we set in train the process as part of rates modernisation, another of the excellent 19 reforms that's on the table, whereby we would reconsider the charities exemptions in terms of local authority rates, water and sewerage rates, and that work, I hope, is still ongoing, and that's a very practical change that affects these sorts of things. So I won't be supporting the motion as submitted to this court. I'm happy to support either of the amendments.
Well, the Honourable Member for Douglas South, Mrs. Christian.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fellow members of the House of Keys, there's more here today that unites us than divides us. Firstly, most of us will have grown up surrounded by the beautiful, precious national heritage. Our culture is steeped in tradition, such as Tynwald Day, Remembrance Day, the Manx National Anthem sung at the Villa, the Gaiety, in our schools, all of which we respect and hold dear to our hearts. Secondly, I hope members agree with me that faith has been the solid rock foundations of which has helped build our wonderful nation and is part of this culture and heritage. Remember the generations of St Maccled, St Ninian, and more recently Henry Bloom Noble. Their passion, faith and generous bequeaths are sewn into the fabric of our culture and are enjoyed by Manx residents today, including St Ninian's Church or the beautiful stained glass windows in the east end of the St George's Church. Thirdly, members of the House of Keys, stewardship is something we can all agree on. Taking care of something dear to our country or caring for our fellow man. Whether you believe in faith or not, I would hope members would agree with me that it is our duty to preserve this through our stewardship, preserving our heritage for our future generations. We must think carefully here today. What is the danger? Think about what we are throwing away. This could be another part of Manx heritage that could be gone for good. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the committee for their collegiate views, and I believe they have good intentions, as did the members who have submitted responses. But I cannot support the motion in front of us today. I cannot turn my back on our Manx traditions, faith and our heritage. As a steward of my constituency, whether religious or not, this should be something that is not lost forever. We need to safeguard the land of our birth and gem of God's earth. I also hold the view that a chaplain may perhaps not have been nominated because the current archdeacon vacancy, as I understand, will be filled in the not too distant future. Mr. Speaker, what has been incredibly apparent is the public have strong views on this topic. The implications of the proposed changes extend far beyond proceedings of the House. It therefore warrants much more consultation and consideration than has so far been allowed, i.e. no public consultation and only 5 days between publication of the proposal and today's debate. As it has been said by my fellow colleagues, we are simply temporarily occupying these seats. And this amendment, which is why, Mr. Speaker, I would like to second the amendment brought, sorry, not second it, but I would have seconded the amendment brought by the Honourable Member, Mrs. Edge. This is not only a decision to be made only by the House of Keys and its current tenants, it should be considered by the wider public. I believe this is a constitutional matter. Fundamentally, it will change the history of this House and will have wider implications and will ripple through our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Call the Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr. Wannenbergh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is something which I didn't think I would ever debate. So what I'm going to say today is something which is personal to me. I agree with Mr. Ashford and Mr. Johnson, totally. Ironically, I agree with Mr. Peters on his views on silly hats and fancy dress. Everyone is entitled to believe what they choose to, and I choose to be a Christian, albeit a very poor one. But I am still a Christian. That is my business, excuse me, and nobody else's. And the fact that I have to debate that and disclose that today, I find, frankly, extremely irritating. All of us here have a desire to improve things for the people of this island. Of course, I recognise that you don't have to be a Christian to do that. I agree with Mr. Hooper that it is our actions that count. I would like to share a quote that resonates deeply with me. It's not a biblical quote, but it champions what Mrs. Christian has just said when she says, caring for our fellow person. Said by Bobby Kennedy on the day that Martin Luther King was killed. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world. So I will vote against this motion. Thank you.
Well, the Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr. Ashford, to speak to the amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to Miss Edge's amendment, while I understand where the Honourable Member for Uncan is coming from, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with pretty much an awful lot, in fact, probably about 90% of what she actually said when she spoke. Unfortunately, I won't be able to support the amendment in the name of Miss Edge, because the concern I have is relation to constitutional implications and standing orders, and who would actually decide, Mr. Speaker, as to whether something's constitutional or not. Raising your hands, Mr. Speaker, because you know fully well where it would actually fall. And I would not want to see the Speaker put in the very unenviable position of deciding if an amendment that was coming forward to standing orders had wider constitutional implications. I think that's a no-win position to be in. So while I see where the Honourable Member for Uncan is coming from, and I wholeheartedly support almost all the remarks, I think actually there's, no pun intended, wider implications with this amendment. So I won't be able to support it.
Calling the Honourable Member for Douglas East, Ms Farragher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having listened with interest to members' excellent input today, I'm going to keep this short and simple. Mr. Speaker, it's my opinion that people should be free to practice any religion or belief system that resonates with them. However, I see no reason for that belief system to be compulsory in any parliament or for people for whom it does not resonate. Removing prayers isn't an anti-religion stance. It's not saying that members can't have a religion. It's simply acknowledging that not all people hold this and thereby improving inclusivity. This is about respect for all members, and I think that applies both here and in wider society as representatives of an increasingly secular island by the standard definition of secular, which is non-religious. As others have touched upon, I don't accept that prayers are our full and complete cultural heritage being introduced in 1863. This Parliament was founded in 979. As a through-and-through Manx woman, my cultural heritage is also Celtic pagan, perhaps more so than Anglo-Saxon Christian. Whilst I would love to see it, importantly, I don't expect that to be reflected and imposed upon everyone at the commencement of Keys. I simply ask all members to reflect upon reciprocating that respect. Thank you.
Calling the Honourable Member for Douglas East, Ms Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start today by declaring an interest in that I'm a member of the Church Congregation of St George and All Saints, and it was me who nominated Archdeacon Andy Brown to fulfil the role of chaplain for the last House. The role of chaplain is not linked to the Archdeacon role. That was simply the successful nomination within our last House, just for clarification. I'm sure everyone here would concur that he fulfilled that role with utmost commitment and capability, as well as a hint of humour, and any debate today is purely about the role itself, not about the way in which it has been undertaken previously. Interestingly, the role of chaplain is not a role that is attributed officially to the Christian faith, and in fact it appears it could be fulfilled by someone of any faith, or none, meaning that any commentary about erosion of Christianity, I believe, is in fact not relevant. This throws some interesting points up about the evolution of the prayer books and why a specific psalm was chosen as the basis for prayers in both Keys and in the other honourable place. It seems the choice of one psalm as the basis for our prayers was made by one chaplain, and it seems to me that this is a limitation of the period of prayerful reflection that we currently have at the commencement of each sitting. Interestingly, as a Christian, I find the current prayer stilted and lacking. It's repetitive and therefore becomes mechanical, rather than really giving the time to stop and to think. To think about consequences of actions, to think about the gravity of the role we have been placed here to fulfil, and to ensure no decision is taken lightly. In fact, Archdeacon Brown routinely changed one of the parts of the psalm to make it more modern and acceptable. No one winced, no one complained. Some people have told me they didn't even notice. While I accept this debate is not as important as, say, poverty, health waiting lists or climate change, I feel that an opportunity to review practices through this debate has been provided, and it is incumbent on us to consider this. At present, the nomination of chaplain allows for one faith group to fulfil the role for 5 years, meaning that although the post in and of itself is not Christian, the reality is that a Christian chaplain is the most likely outcome, with no opportunity for those of other faiths or no faiths to ever feel truly represented. Equally, if a non-Christian was successfully nominated, there would be 5 years with no Christian input in this honourable House. On being requested to submit a nomination for chaplain, I felt this was an optimal time to consider, to reflect, and to suggest an alternative mechanism. I submitted my thoughts on this, and they are published in full in the report. I was hopeful a compromise could be found, a compromise wherein no one is left feeling uncomfortable in this honourable court. I thought the proposal before us today provided this, in that almost certainly the weekly contributions would be predominantly Christian, being that is the prevailing faith of our island. But there would be an easy route in terms of hearing from other groups within a rota structure by nomination. We would likely see the majority of those nominated to provide the Smoon Act coming from a Christian faith. That would be in the gift of everyone sitting here today, or those who will take these seats in the future. But as I say, we would provide an opportunity for those of minority Christian denominations, those of other faiths, and those of none, to attend this honourable court and provide either a short period of prayerful or mindful reflection as part of a wider rota. We would acknowledge clearly that the value is placed on all faiths and no faiths. We would make it clear that no one voice should be heard louder than others. The fact this role is a Christian construct, as I've said, is only by historic convention, rather than by any formal ruling within the standing orders, and surely this nullifies the argument around erosion of the presence of faith within our processes and procedures. I do believe we are guardians in these roles, but to suggest that that means to not change anything that falls under the title of tradition really does concern me. There are many traditions that we have rightly moved away from, and to suggest we keep something simply for tradition's sake gives me concern. I say all of the above as a committed Christian who does not feel it necessary to practice my faith at work as well as in my personal life, and who believes chaplaincy services, which are in fact unspecified within this role, can be adequately provided elsewhere. I thank the Bishop for his offer in this regard and recognise that there are other people in other faiths and those of none who can also provide chaplaincy services and do so across our island already. Some people have contacted us talking of the need to pray to make good decisions, and I'm simply not convinced of the argument. In my previous role, I worked with colleagues in the hospital, making a number of incredibly important life and death decisions. We did not routinely pray before making them, and I never doubted the care and consideration given by colleagues prior to making those decisions when they didn't have a faith, any more than I doubt the good faith of colleagues in this honourable court, whether they have a faith or none.
As a Christian, it's not only straight after prayer I would hope to make sound decisions. It needs to be all the time. This stands true for those of all faiths and those of none. I took time to reflect on learning that prayers made others feel uncomfortable in this honourable court, and I'm sorry I hadn't realised that sooner. My faith was making others uncomfortable. I spend a lot of time, really a lot of time, telling my 2 little boys to stop doing things. They will sing songs over and over again, gleeful at the irritation it causes the other one. Sometimes they copy everything the other one says. Sometimes they just make really annoying noises. They often argue with me that they're not hurting anyone, and they're often right. But I point out that their actions are making someone uncomfortable or are upsetting someone, and we should always reconsider what we do when we know this to be the case. It would be hypocritical of me not to act similarly in my own behaviours. I will be supporting the report as tabled today, seeing this not as a removal of prayers, but rather an addition of mindful reflection opportunities to the prayerful reflection opportunity that we already have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Call on the Honourable Member for Glenfaber and Peel, Mrs Lord-Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hadn't got anything particular prepared for today, but I've been listening with interest as to the contributions that have been brought forward. And the first thing that comes to mind is that who'd have thought that we would have ended up getting onto constitutional matters, philosophical matters, theological matters, was something that has come from a House of Keys Management Committee, which makes me feel that this is something that has gone actually really, really off track. And I'm quite sure that there will be a lot of members of the public who are thinking, what on earth are they spending their time on in here? What on earth are they thinking about? I think this absolutely is extending further beyond what is proposed about something which is procedural. Of course, it extends further than that. And I think in some ways the report is kind of both in... It's both overdoing this matter as an issue, as something that needs to be addressed, which I don't think it does, and also it's underdoing its response if it does feel that something needs to change. This is massively disconnected, I think, from what lots of people on the Isle of Man feel is the case. I think that the strong representation that has been brought forward compared to many other issues needs to be recognised and respected. We don't necessarily need to dissect everything. We can't put ourselves in a position where we can think it's realistic to come up with something that will at one time not offend everybody and also satisfy everybody. It's just a completely ridiculous road to go down from my perspective. And actually, what's being put forward to us here against something which is whether you stand there and wholeheartedly say the prayers, whether or not you recognise connections with the broader Tynwald process or things like Remembrance Day and all these, whether or not you recognise those things, the fact is the Isle of Man sees and recognises those prayers as being something more about the culture, the history of the Isle of Man, about values. I can't remember who it was that said about having that, that time, I think it might have been Mr. Hooper that said having that quiet time of reflection that makes you think, actually, why you're here. And I think this matter about it affecting how people do their jobs, how they approach their representation is just not the case at all. I do wonder, though, what is the real proposal here? What are we trying to do away with that we're so keen to do away with and so satisfied with what the alternative might be? Because to my mind, the idea of standing here in silence or carrying out something which sounds like it's from Lord of the Rings, and also I'm not quite sure that we will get some kind of everybody coming together and being satisfied with what that proposal or what that alternative sermon or service might be. I think that might cause loads more offence. So why even bother to address it in this way? I think if it does need to be looked at, then to me, this isn't about management, because we're starting to talk about managing people's faith, and the community is responding to this, and I certainly know in Glenfaber and Peel, huge concern, masses of concern. I've lost count of the number of emails I've had, and it doesn't really matter, the specific details. They're just saying, what are you doing? What are you removing? What is this the start of? So I think this isn't even this isn't even a House of Keys Management Committee matter. It really, if it's so important to address, why hasn't it come forward from the House of Keys or being considered by House of Keys Standing Orders Committee? So, because I'm not compelled by the alternative proposal, the silence, because actually some of the contributions I've heard, you know, Mr. Wannenburgh's contribution, there was warmth and consideration and thought in that. You know, politics is a hard business, it's a hard game. That sort of approach where you get back to the softer side, the value side of things, that, I think we all need to hear that from time to time. I felt also that when, although I respect of you, Mrs. Haywood's contribution, it left me cold. You know, there is more to life and business than, you know, than science and technology. So I just think there's a comparison here in terms of how, you know, how people are feeling about this, and I feel a responsibility actually to reflect in some of the thoughts that have been, well, the strong voices that have been put to me. So I can't support the report recommendations. I think that would be really difficult to manage. I'm happy also, though, to support the amendment from Mrs. Maltby. I'm just not sure really that this is an evolution. This isn't positive, you know, and I think it is a small erosion that we're not really sure what the implications are. And I don't think it's helpful to use it in leave the House of Keys in a sort of vacuum of silence at the start of every sitting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Call the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Dr. Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Garth for bringing forward these recommendations very much on behalf of the committee. I also would like to thank honourable members for the dignified way we've had this discussion, because it is very personal to a lot of people. But going back to the reason the committee was looking at this was purely because there's a vacancy there, and nobody has come forward so far with a recommendation for who should fill that vacancy. So I think it's absolutely right to then consider if we can't fill that seat, should the seat still be there, or how else we deal with this. I do agree with some other members who say that we haven't really had a chance to consider all the ramifications for this. And I think this debate has shown that different people have seen different things into this. It's suddenly become a constitutional crisis, a theological crisis, a philosophical debate, whereas in fact it's all about one chair in the chamber and what goes on within these four walls. I've been very humbled over the last 5 days with constituents contacting me saying that when they listen to us in the morning on Tuesdays, they pray with us and for us. I think that what we're talking about here is that connection with our constituents, so that we both represent them, but they are seen also to have us connecting with them in that very visceral way. But do I feel that the prayers that we have said every Tuesday, almost by rota, are the right way of having that connection? I think it's absolutely the right time to think of other ways of having that connection, of introducing other denominations, other faiths, other spiritual ideas to set the tone, so that we are absolutely aware that what we say within these four walls has repercussions far wider, both for our nation and internationally, that we take seriously what we say here being heard by other people. And setting that scene at the start of a sitting, I think, is very important. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call on the Honourable Member for Garth, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've heard this morning, and as you may imagine, I am not the only member who has been inundated with a tirade of both verbal and written comments, unequivocally and fervently opposing any change to the current format of House of Keys chaplaincy and prayers. Many of my observations are expressed most eloquently within the numerous messages received, and I will just mention a few pertinent quotes. The first one: the proposed abolition of prayers in the House of Keys carries implications that extend far beyond the management of the proceedings of the House. A decision by the primary chamber of the Manx Parliament to change its cultural framework from Christian to secular would be a significant and historic step. The logical consequence of the move would include ending prayers in Tynwald, abolishing the Road of the Lord's Bishop, and removing the religious elements from the annual Tynwald ceremony. I doubt the public is ready for the church service at St John's to be replaced by an open-air yoga session. Whatever one's views, this is clearly more than a matter of internal house management to be decided amongst MHKs on the basis of what they are personally comfortable with. The House of Keys is an institution belonging to the Isle of Man and its people, not a club for members who are temporarily occupying seats there. As a Manx institution, it could be argued the House should reflect and respect the heritage of the island, which, whether we like it or not, is strongly Christian. And from the second quote, as a Manxman, I am saddened that an attempt is being made to adversely change the predominantly Christian culture of our island, and I fail to see any merit in the proposal. Is a change to our tradition, which is part of our unique heritage and which has been valued and maintained for many generations by predecessors, justifiable? Who would benefit from the proposed change? Which part of the electorate would it appeal to? Most members of the House regard it as a tremendous privilege to serve their community and take this very seriously, their responsibility for determining the policies that are best for our island. Are there some who are concerned that a Christian perspective may prejudice their judgment? I and many others believe, and the few minutes prayers and meditation is a valuable part of the proceedings of the House. You will already be aware that there is a substantial number of the voters in Garth who are not happy with this proposal, and some are asking, what next? This was to both Daphne and myself. I am writing to you as MHKs to express my profound dismay at the proposal to remove the chaplain of the Keys and tradition of morning prayers. I ask members to think very carefully before they throw out those historic elements of custom and practice and make Tynwald, with its branches, a unique parliamentary institution. While custom and practice does evolve and reform over the years, this should not be done on a whim which appears to derive largely from the increasing number of newer members who happen to be atheists. Members of Tynwald are all birds of passage, and they join an institution that is timeless and bigger than the individuals who may inhabit it at any one time. Over the years, most members come to realise this. The chaplaincy goes back 150 years, and abolishing the ritual of morning prayers along with it will, I fear, not be the harmless removal of what is thought to be a trivial anchorism. I see the thin end of the wedge, with consequences of other aspects of Tynwald's ceremonial practice evolved through centuries-old Judeo-Christianism, tradition on which this country is based, especially Tynwald Day itself. I have always maintained that as an institution, today's Tynwald is a happy blend of ancient and modern. It would be a great pity if this character was needlessly chipped away by here today, gone tomorrow politicians, and I have been such myself. You may guess who's been writing this, when Tynwald will be sitting going forward after we are all gone. This again to both Daphne and myself. It is with great concern that I learn of the recommendation to be placed before the House of Keys that prayer on the commencement of sitting should no longer happen and the role of chaplain be disbanded. The essence of Christian beliefs and standards are very much the foundation of the Islandman's heritage, and such a detrimental move deeply undermines the essence and all values which the island has upheld over indeed many centuries. For example, are the Mattle crosses no longer significant because they have their roots in Christianity? Our national anthem proclaims the presence of God as our creator, preserver and governor in the words, O gem of God's earth. Is this no longer to be sung at gatherings? Will the MHKs and dignitaries who back the proposal claiming their parliament is secular no longer attend the service at St John's before processing to Tynwald Hill, where presumably prayers and the national anthem will be said? Surely this is hypocritical. From my experience as a local preacher, I can testify to the fact that there are many, many folk on the island who have a deep Christian faith and are greatly disturbed by the ensuing proposal. It is also disappointing that MHKs who are backing this proposal did not clearly state on their manifestos their religious or otherwise creeds in order that an informed decision on suitable representation could be made at the election. Surely a person's beliefs largely determine their actions and as such is persuasive in obtaining support in an election. I sit on the Government Review Tribunal Board for Mental Health, and I'm convinced that the sad increase in mental health problems, particularly amongst young people, is largely because foundations of faith, which has a stabilising effect in life, have been eroded. I see the removal of spiritual input by the highest office of government is a real significant factor which will contribute to destroying the fabric of our Manx culture and heritage. I therefore confirm that I oppose the stopping of prayers and position of chaplain in the House of Keys, and consider that the place of Christianity in which the Manx traditions are rooted and founded should be upheld and preserved for future generations. Mr. Speaker, just over 4 months ago I stood before this House and the nation and proclaimed the following oath of allegiance. Today I will pronounce it in English. I do swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors. It is worthy to note also that Her Majesty is Lord of Man, Head of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. The oath was then administered to me. Her Majesty's counsel, your fellows and your own, you shall not reveal. You shall use your best endeavours to maintain the ancient laws and customs of this isle. You shall justly and truly deliver your opinion and do right in all matters which shall be put unto you without favour or affection, affinity or consanguinity, love or fear, reward or gain, or for any hope thereof. But in all things you shall deal uprightly and justly and do wrong to no man. So help you God by the contents of this book. Mr. Speaker, finally, I believe are most apt, I highlight the words penned by W.H. Gill and contained within Arain Ashunag Vannin, the Manx national anthem. Throughout the 8 verses, and I won't read them all, there is a significant common theme, like blood flows through the body, inextricably permeating the whole existence. I will leave it to honourable members to research. However, I leave you with the first and last verses. O land of our birth, O gem of God's earth, O island so strong and so fair, built firm as Barule, thy throne of home rule makes us free as thy sweet mountain air. Then let us rejoice with heart, soul and voice, and in the Lord's promise confide, that each single hour with trust in his power, no evil our souls can betide. I will not be supporting the motion before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Favour and Peel. Mr. CROOKALL.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start off by thanking everybody for their comments today and their views, and also all the emails which we've all had, I'm sure, dozens and dozens and dozens, especially over the last couple of days as we've got closer towards today, and the words which we've had when I've been out walking, talking to people as well. Don't you dare. You make sure you get rid of it. Both sides, absolutely. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank Andy Brown, as I never got the opportunity when he left as chaplain, the former chaplain, to leave us in this position. It's not about throwing out the chaplain's position at all. We found ourselves in this position, Mr. Speaker, because we couldn't find a replacement. If we'd have found a replacement, if somebody had nominated 2 or 3, I think last time we probably had 5 or 6 nominations. If we'd have had nominations and we'd had a choice, we wouldn't be having this discussion here today. But it's actually quite good to have it to get people's views from inside here and from outside and see how they feel. And I'm pleased with the views that we've had from both sides. But what it's also about is compromises and choices. The committee wrote to everybody, and we had a small response, I would say, from members of Tynwald, and you got those in the report today. But fundamentally, I would say we have to find a way forward. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker, but 5 years of listening to you doing prayers, sir, I'd like to find another way around it. I think you've got 2 recommendations today. There's the silence one, or there's the Smuin Act, and we've had some amendments as well. So we've got the choices here today. I personally don't mind which we go for. I quite like a bit of peace and quiet now and again. I certainly don't object to prayers. But I actually like the idea as well of people coming into us for that giving us their thoughts from different religions or thought for the day, as they do on Radio 2. But we've got those choices there today. So I hope members will think about how they vote for this really, really carefully. There's only one amendment that I won't be thinking about supporting, and that's Miss Edge's. I don't think I could support that in any way, shape or form. But the others I'm more than happy to think about. And I just ask members to think carefully about how they vote. And it's not about changing, permanent change. The Smoon Act is for 12 months. It's a trial period. So just think about that. And if it doesn't work, we can go back again and maybe look for a chaplain again in 12 months. But it's all about the choices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Call Mr. Cannan, Honourable Member for Ayr and Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also acknowledge to honourable members some of the contributions that have been made this morning and the quality of some of those contributions on both sides of the argument. There have been some very powerful remarks made that have given significant food for thought. And you'll forgive me, therefore, if I just make some observations on what has been put before us today, based on my own thoughts, but also on perhaps some of the contributions that have been made. First of all, I think it is a fair reflection to say perhaps, in my view, the Management and Members Standards Committee have perhaps underestimated the impact of what the proposals meant to so many people, both inside but more importantly outside this chamber. And I would suggest that the manner in which the report was presented and also the timescales involved in terms of the time allowed for public reflection perhaps have not been appropriate. And perhaps that is just a result of the way the committee have gone about their business. But nevertheless, I do feel it is important to consider that in the overall context of this debate. The second point I would suggest about the manner in which this conclusion that we're discussing today has been reached is that I felt the letter, which acted effectively as a consultation to honourable members, was fairly straightforward in its approach, in that it called for nominations for the chaplain. It didn't say, in the event of having no nominations, we're therefore going to propose to abolish the position, I think, which may have drawn out a slightly different response. And I'm certainly unclear at this stage as to why the fact that no nominations were received either didn't mean a second call for nominations or perhaps a more direct approach to the churches on the island. And I do note, of course, that in the lists of those who have held the position of chaplain to the House of Keys, amongst which I note the very esteemed Cannan was once holding that position, my grandfather, that indeed the position has been held by both Anglican and Methodist ministers, and I see no reason why a suitable further denomination could have come, and I don't see that it was necessarily restricted to the Anglican Church in terms of the chaplaincy of the Keys. So I think the proposal certainly around the chaplain has not necessarily been clear, and I think the committee, in my view, have jumped to a conclusion, perhaps without exploring the matter further around the nomination process. There's been plenty of examples where one round of calls for candidates, particularly when I look at Legislative Council, for example, which is the obvious one, has not necessarily resulted in a full declaration of everybody's hands. And I also go to the point, similarly, to reflect on the point regarding prayers, in that, of course, the Speaker's letter at the time did ask us to give us some thoughts around prayers. But again, it wasn't perhaps indicating that there was going to be such a radical change in approaches. And I'm not overly criticising the letter, because in its context of appointing a chaplain and perhaps looking at the way prayers were delivered, it is reasonable. But perhaps the extent of the committee's conclusion should have perhaps been reflected in a further period of consultation, which I think may well have enabled perhaps a more reflective period for engagement when it comes particularly to the public. So the second reflection I want to make is that I think that it is pretty clear to me that many people are unclear as to what statement is actually being made with these proposals. Because I totally understand the appropriate conclusion I think that many people are making, that there is a move to declare that the Christian faith is no longer appropriate for Tynwald to either promote or provide itself, base itself as a framework within which to operate. And of course, I do take the contrary view to my good friend Mrs. Paul Wilson, in terms of the fact that actually it does then potentially call into question what now for other religious elements to our Tynwald processes and procedures, particularly obviously the Lord Bishop position, and of course the Tynwald Day Church service, in terms of being incompatible with what appears to be the underlying statement coming from many quarters who are supporting this, that this is a move to a secular parliament and to reflect a secular society. Now, that is quite a significant shift, I think, in terms of the constitution, in inverted commas, of Tynwald and the history and traditions on which we base ourselves. And I'm merely moved to point out, without wishing to engage in a one-to-one argument on certain elements, but that when the point was made that the church service on Tynwald Day is just a ceremony, of course, one also then reflects on the basis that could that not also be argued about prayers in the House of Keys being a ceremony, and people's views, of course, vis-a-vis that sitting in prayers is uncomfortable and sitting in a church service is not uncomfortable. It seems to me that actually the thought process is very confused in that space. And I think that my key point relating to that is that actually we do need a lot more thought then about what actually we are moving towards by disassociating ourselves from prayers. Either is this because we are a secular parliament and we are making a statement about a secular society, or is it because we are wishing just to move on a comfort level because we want to be more inclusive in the House of Keys, and what is the relationship to that to our traditions? The third point I wanted to make, if indeed this argument around secular is the one that is the overriding one, that we're in a secular society, which of course I'm potentially going to counteract in a minute, but what is the exact determination of secular? It seems to me that we are now making a clear statement in the House of Keys, and by virtue of our elected roles, and I would suggest the primary house in that respect, that Tynwald should not be connected with religious or spiritual matters, and I think that element, I'm probably just repeating myself, needs to be explained further. And then, of course, I think that's further enhanced by the respondees to the consultation. I think there are a number of responses within those consultees which perhaps lack evidence, and have made statements about our society which I think really are not being backed up by facts, and are perhaps loose interpretations of what has been presented in the census. And I acknowledge the in-depth analysis that was presented by my good friend, the Treasury Minister, in that respect. But also perhaps to go to the fundamentals of that census report, that 54.7% of our population identify as Christian, but also that 43.8% say they have no religion. But I then move myself on to actually question, what does that actually mean? I think also there is a significant difference between the word reform and abandonment, and I don't think that the House of Keys has had a proper time to reflect on that matter. And of course, in terms of comparisons with Welsh parliaments and Scottish parliaments, as many people have pointed out, in terms of the longevity, Tynwald and the House of Keys will extend back 1,000 years in history, and the Welsh Parliament and Scottish Parliaments were formed in 1999, relatively relative newbies in the great scheme of Parliament. And I also finally conclude, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and why, of course, would you move from a point where people have to turn up for prayers to a point where they have to turn up for a period of thought, or a shmunak, if that is the correct pronunciation. And equally, how is that going to be presented when individuals perhaps may take an alternative view to that one that is being presented? So, Mr. Speaker, with those thoughts in mind, with my view that this decision is not been thought through properly, that any report and recommendation in this respect needs to carry consideration of the wider implications, whether they exist or not, and how that is presented and what it actually means for tradition and for the manner in which this House conducts its business. And in the interim, I will give my support to Ms Maltby's amendment that members should be free to participate in prayers or not, and the Management and Members Standards Committee should consider and report on how to give effect to this principle. And I also would suggest, I hope that if that amendment gets the support, or if the report is rejected at this stage, that the committee do give further thought as to how in the future they would consider these types of matters. And in that respect, although it doesn't sound as if Ms Edge's amendment is going to get support, I will also add my weight to the view that her amendment does carry some merit in that, you know, the committee, when they are reporting on these types of issues, I think have taken a very narrow view, and they should perhaps, all committees should perhaps reflect, particularly around standing orders and management of Tynwald, about heritage and also wider constitutional implications.
Thank you. Now, honourable members, I'm conscious that we have CPD guests coming in at 1:30. Members may want to get some lunch first. However, I want to take the temperature as to whether, with focus and restraints, we might get summing up done before, and that would complete the business of the House this morning. I shall put the question. Those in favour of continuing to finish the business at this point, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. In which case, I will invite somebody up. First, Ms Edge, if you wish to sum up to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think the key part of my amendment is the public consultation on any significant change to the island, and just really thank anybody that has contributed with that regard, but that is the key change. I think sending back to the same committee to come back with something is perhaps not the best way forward. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mrs Maltby, sum up.
Only very briefly, my amendment was to try and prevent anybody feeling alienated. That's the last thing I would want anybody to feel, and I hope that this amendment brings a sense of balance and a bit of time for everybody to cool off and to reflect on all the comments that have been made today, and to be able to come back with maybe slightly amended recommendations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mrs Cain to respond to the main motion.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank everybody for all the contributions today. I think they're truly reflective of the breadth of opinion both within this court and beyond. I can go through individual contributions if you wish, or I could address the major themes which I think have been thrown up through the high calibre of debate here today. People have questioned where is the demand for this reform, and is it a step too far? And I would say the committee really felt tasked to look for alternatives because of the submissions that we received, and they numbered 9, and no nominations for chaplain. So, yes, I do accept and acknowledge perhaps there was another moment that we could have gone out for more. But I also feel, what a way to consult, what the public consultation on members. Doesn't it focus the mind when you have only 5 days? And I also have received more public input over the last weekend since the report was published on the front page of the Manx Independent than I received combined for any other matter in the past 5 months that we are discussing in this place. And I thank the public for that, and I also fully respect the strength of opinion and the thought that there are wider implications to be considered. I think if I could just touch on a couple of members. I am really grateful for the considered way that our two self-affirming Christian members, Mrs Poole-Wilson and Mrs Barber, have, for all their input and all their consideration. And it is about inclusivity, and it is about consideration for other members, and it was never about removing Christianity from this honourable House. It was about giving consideration for a modernising, for an alternative to participatory prayers. And the element that we agreed as a committee was the factor giving some members, making some members uncomfortable, was the participation element of the chanting element of the prayers that was routinely given. And I think it is a really helpful suggestion to think that in future consideration, if as I hope Mrs Maltby's amendment is supported, that the committee can reflect on the whole debate and all the suggestions and ensure that whatever solutions are put forward does have perhaps more of an element of floating it past the members of this House. I'm also strongly aware that we're quite often criticised for not having our debates and our briefings in public. Well, this time it was all in public. There was no time for private briefings or lobbying, aside from the members of our public and our constituents getting in contact with us. This is it. This is all the members debating in public. And while I feel it is a procedural matter, it is a process within the business and how we operate this House of Keys, I accept that some feel that there are wider constitutional implications, or certainly for the wider Tynwald ceremony. I don't feel that. I think this is about this individual house and the business, and is there a more modern, a better way, a more inclusive way to start proceedings. And I also notice that despite the absence of chaplain, the Bishop reaffirmed the availability of pastoral care, but I don't think he was suggesting that he could act as chaplain in the absence of any nominated chaplain, and we're very grateful to him for that. And also giving due consideration to the Bishop's submission and his comment in the Manx Independent, where he's quoted as saying he's supportive of widening the repertoire. And I think the Bishop, more than anybody, recognises that to be truly representative of everybody, that there is merit in that, and there is merit in what the committee was attempting to do, although I do appreciate from the many contributions the suggestion that it requires more thought, more in-depth consideration of the future. If I could turn to Mr Moorhouse, the Honourable Member for Arbury, Castletown and Maloo, and he questioned, was a member of the committee worried about not fulfilling their role in the Keys? Well, the Honourable Member may be aware that as Deputy Speaker, should Mr Speaker be absent for any reason, and without a current post holder in the post of chaplain, that a person of no faith would be leading the prayers in this chamber. And I would say that might be a little uncomfortable for some other members, and I wouldn't want to be the cause of anybody being uncomfortable or not feeling included. I absolutely uphold the traditions of this honourable place, but if that event were to become an eventuality, then I do think that this House, this committee, needs to give further thought to the best way to take that forward. I have a couple of other points to make, and I think it is really important that whatever frame of mind we are in when we get into this House, we clear the mind away from the hurly-burly business of outside. Pause, reflect, prepare, consider the magnitude of the decisions that we may be going to take. I think I will skip through. There's so many excellent contributions from many, many people. In terms of the two amendments, I find that, in my opinion, I don't really support that of the Honourable Member for Onchan Miss Edge. I think that public consultation will be time-consuming and unwieldy and unnecessary for every change to our own standing orders, which is how we run our business. But I do accept that members feel that the decision over changing the process with the beginning with prayers and that for some feel that that goes beyond just a pause for thought, and that the suggestions that the committee have come up, I'm feeling, while I'm appreciating some support that members have made, I am gathering from the general consensus that there is a thought that we need to go back and give it more support. And I'm also conscious, my honourable member colleague for Garth, Mr Smith, read out amongst them the submission and the email that we received from the former Speaker of this honourable place and former President Tynwald. We are all birds of passage. We all have a responsibility to uphold tradition, but tradition shouldn't be at the expense of being more inclusive and considering what change we can achieve without throwing baby out with the bathwater, without bringing down the whole edifice or functioning of our Parliament and our parliamentary ceremonies. I thank Mr CROOKALL as a member of the committee for his considered input, and I agree what we were suggesting is a trial period of 12 months. So if members support the report and the recommendations as suggested, that is just suggesting a trial period of 12 months, which after 12 months can be reviewed and others can come forward. But I equally take on board Mr Cannan, Member for Michael's suggestion, and he felt it was too radical in the approach to change, and he thought it needed a lot more thought. So now we're back to Smunyukton, and whatever thought we give it, I think that there is more thought to be had, and certainly from the Lord Bishop's comments, he has great sympathy for those members who found the current system deeply uncomfortable, and he would be sorry if the place of Christianity was lost. Well, so would I, and I can only say that as a member of that committee, I think the best course is to support the amendment from the Honourable Member Mrs Maltby and see how better we can engage both with members and the public to find a better way forward. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you. We now turn to the voting, and just to explain how we will run this, the amendment that is furthest away from the original motion is Ms Edge's. I will put that motion first. If that motion carries, that will then become the main motion, and we would vote on it as the main motion. If it fails, we will move to Mrs Maltby's amendment, and if that carries, that would become the main motion. It completely displaces the motion on the order paper. If Mrs Maltby's motion fails, then we will revert to the motion on the order paper, and I will take each of the recommendations in turn. I hope that's clear to honourable members. We'll turn first to Ms Edge's amendment. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no?
No.
The noes have it. The noes have it. Turning then to Mrs Maltby's amendment. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no?
No. Divide.
Yeah, division called. (17 votes for, 6 against. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I therefore put Mrs Maltby's amendment as the main motion. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no?
No.
The ayes have it.
Aye.
Division called. (20 votes for, 3 against. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Now that that debate has concluded, honourable members, can I commend you all for the very well thought through and respectful contributions there were in that debate. This was an excellent reflection of the House on an issue that goes to a deep level of who we are as people, as an institution and as a society, and the interaction of each. There is indeed much for the committee to reflect on. As far as the CPD session that I mentioned, that will start 10 minutes late at 1:40. And with that, the House is adjourned until our next scheduled sitting on Tuesday the 15th of February in Tynwald Court. Thank you very much.